I'm Dr. Dan Long. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I'm a staff psychologist at the WVU Carruth Center for Counseling and Psychological Services. I'm also the director of assessment services and of something called the MindFit Clinic, which began in 2009. The mission of the MindFit Clinic broadly is to help students overcome academic obstacles. We do that in a number of ways. Before we lead in, you may be wondering why I have this individual on the screen swinging a kettlebell. And the reason for that is we think about the MindFit Clinic kind of like a mental gym, a cognitive gym for folks to come and strengthen facets of their attention and their cognitive functioning. And of course, the other reason we have it up there is that anytime you potentially improve cognitive functioning, you potentially confer benefits to anything under the purview of the brain. And so, not surprisingly, increasingly athletes are beginning to use some of the interventions that we have here in our clinic for the purpose of performance enhancement. So here are the three broad areas of MindFit. And I'll just say a little bit about how we got started. We actually got started in 2009. We were approached by our psychiatric colleagues at the time. They expressed a lot of concern about an epidemic that was not only occurring here on the campus of WVU, but of course nationally. And that epidemic, of course, is one that we're probably all familiar with, which is college-age students presenting ostensibly with symptoms of attentional difficulties and asking for stimulant medications. We know based on the literature about 35% of those who present with ADHD symptoms are probably not earnest in their presentation. There's some studies that show, again, up to about 35% are malingering. So we actually got our start because we wanted to try to offer our psychiatric colleagues some data, some objective data to help further inform their medication evaluation decisions. We created a screening clinic. That screening clinic was still in existence up until about a year ago. We saw about 100 to 150 students per semester through that screening clinic. We published a study last year in Applied Neuropsychology Adult. It was a kind of an interesting study where there's an N, a sample size of about 350. Of course, you can look this up, but in the study, we have college students coming to our clinic who are seeking stimulant medication evaluations with psychiatry, and we put them through some of our testing, including a performance validity test. And what we found is that, consistent with the literature, about 35% fail that performance validity test. Now, this is a test that is an effort test, but it looks like a memory test. The people with severe forms of pathology, memory issues, pass this thing with flying colors. So people with dementia and fetal alcohol syndrome do just fine on this test. So if you're an 18 or 19-year-old, apparently healthy young man or young woman, and you're failing this test, then there are some real problems. And then based on the failure rates, we're able to look at what are their patterns of performance on computerized measures of attention and impulse control. So that was the screening clinic, and we started doing those as well as our more comprehensive assessment services, and then moved on to adding some services in the following year. The first area that we added was our cognitive enhancement services, and this really came from some frustration not having other options for our students. You know, for many, medication is contraindicated, there can be adverse side effects, or simply students just don't, they would like another route. They don't want to feel that they have to rely upon something external to enhance their performance and their cognitive functioning. So we brought Neurofeedback and Coggle Training. We're one of the first, I think, one of the first university counseling centers to ever do that. We've been doing that for almost 10 years and have a really good track record doing that. We'll talk more about that in a moment. The second area is our academic enhancement area. We added that in 2014. This is not just tutoring, but it's sort of specialized coaching. The idea is to try to teach students how to become better learners so they can become more autonomous. If we do our job right, so it's capacity building in that regard. We're trying to improve their executive functioning and generally their approach, their habits, their skills and attitudes, academically speaking. And so the hope is that after we work with them for a semester or two, that they don't need us anymore. It's a failing business model if it goes well, as it were. And then, of course, the last area is our assessment services, which we just talked about. So we do all of the LD, ADHD, psychoeducational testing to provide the documentation requirements necessary for a student to be granted academic accommodations to the university. And we're increasing our standard of practice over this year, so we've done away with the screenings, and now it is policy that if someone wants to be seen here at Carruth by one of our psychiatrists, they go through our testing clinic first. And then, as I alluded to earlier, we've done some work with peak performance. Our first was working with Rifle. We had an Olympian come to us and say, hey, I heard that this guy from India was doing neurofeedback and ended up winning the gold medal, and I want to do neurofeedback, and I hear you do neurofeedback. And so we worked with him, worked with Rifle for 4 consecutive NCAA championships, Olympic medals. I had a secondary appointment with athletics for a few years, so we worked with a number of different teams. And then we've also worked with Olympic athletes. And then last year, I was a consultant for Nike, the Nike Oregon project with some of their marathon runners. So all those intros out of the way, now you understand a little bit about what the clinic is involved in. The next thing to talk about is kind of the spirit of the clinic. The spirit of it is all about growth mindset, which is a term that was popularized by Stanford psychologist Dr. Carol Dweck. And it is very different from the type of spirit and mindset I think often contained within university settings and cultures. Typically, a university operates more from what we might call fixed or disability-based mindset. And so the idea there is that factors like intelligence, attention, etc., these are fixed and rigid. They're immutable. They're unlikely to change over time. And if that's the case, then if the person comes across or comes up against adversity, then this becomes really an opportunity for embarrassment or shame. And so adversity is then something to be avoided, and the person then really grows. The growth mindset is a very different idea. It's the idea that a lot of these variables that we just discussed are flexible, can be cultivated, can be trained over time. And if that's the case, then adversity is not something to be to hide from or to avoid, but is rather an opportunity for learning and growth. And so that's really the spirit of MindFit. And so there's some controversy around this topic. You know, can we improve attention and memory and facets of cognitive performance? And you know, probably the answer is to some degree. You know, there's some research that we'll kind of talk about here real briefly. But first, let me introduce you to some of the interventions that we use. So the first area is neurofeedback. It's kind of like, if you don't know anything about neurofeedback or EEG, biofeedback, it's kind of like doing mindfulness meditation, but with a computer. The importance of the feedback is pretty straightforward in a way. I mean, if I'm walking down the street and I walk in front of a department store mirror and I look into the mirror, I can use the feedback from that mirror to make adjustments to how I'm doing. I can see I need to suck my gut in, I need to get rid of some dirt on my shirt. And so in the same way, we're wanting to provide feedback to the brain, but we're providing feedback about information that it ordinarily does not have access to. And that information is information about how well it's regulating its own electrical functioning. We know about the great proprioceptive and interoceptive capabilities of the brain, but you know, certainly this is one area where some sort of external source of feedback becomes very useful in helping the nervous system to learn how to better regulate itself. The research is promising for certain things. We have to be careful. There are some folks out there who sell neurofeedback like it's the great panacea. It seems like they're snake oil salesmen, and they're attempting to state that neurofeedback can be used for anything and everything under the sun. And I don't believe that. You know, in our clinic, we try to stay in our lane. We've really tried to specialize in a circumscribed problem area, which is that of boosting attentional functioning. And with that regard, or within that area of research, what we find is that neurofeedback can be just as effective as medication in some cases. If you've never seen it, now I don't know if this will play, so you have to let me know if you can see this. Can you see this video playing right now? If so, hopefully you can. If not, I guess you'll see it on playback. But this is actually from 2010. and I'm putting sensors on this young woman's scalp. This is someone who used to work, she was a trainee here. And here you see her, she's playing a video game. She's flying a spaceship. She's controlling the direction with a PlayStation controller, but the gas pedal is her brain. So when her brain is kind of making a certain pattern, the spaceship speeds up and the sounds get louder, the sights get brighter. And in the next scene, you'll see her doing something very similar where she is driving a car, but in this case, what you don't see is that I'm off screen trying to distract her a bit, and what you'll notice is this car is going to begin to slow down, and the sky is going to begin to flicker black, and eventually it's going to come to a complete halt. And what this is doing is giving real-time feedback to the brain about what's going on in that space between the ears. Here's some very old EEG software that we used to use. We're kind of light years beyond this now, but it's kind of interesting for posterity to look back. Here she's watching a movie while doing neurofeedback. You'll notice the screen is beginning to shrink there. So as a particular pattern is beginning to falter, that screen begins to shrink, the sound will begin to die, and even the screen will begin to gray or black out. So hopefully it gives you just a little bit of a sense of what neurofeedback looks like. Some of the research, here's some interesting 2010 data. What they did across the abscissa, the x-axis on this graph, those are individual participants. So participant 1 all the way on the left, participant 247 all the way on the right. And the ordinate axis, is the dependent variable in the study, and it is their scores on a CPT measure, a continuous or computerized continuous performance test of attention and impulse control. These are 4 subtests of CPT sort of combined into one composite. And what you find is really interesting. For the most part, most people get better. They demonstrate real big improvements on this test of attention. And the other thing that you'll notice is that not everybody gets better. There are some cases who actually stay about the same or get marginally worse. So, clearly there right away, statistically, you see, of course, this is going to help for everybody, just like therapy doesn't help for everybody, medication doesn't work for everybody, etc. But the other interesting finding here is that those who start off with a lower pretest score, the pretest, of course, my apologies, pretest is the kind of pink lines, the blue lines are the post-test scores, so this is before and after neurofeedback. What you can see is that those who have a lower pretest score, all the way on the left, like participant 1, demonstrate or exhibit the greatest increases in performance on this test. And of course, those who already start close to the ceiling on the right, they're not going to make much change, but they nevertheless, some of them still do. So that's kind of a fascinating finding. On this next slide, this is probably the worst slide I've ever seen prepared in a scientific publication, but we'll go ahead and slog through it. Essentially what they're doing in this is they're comparing a medication group and a neurofeedback group, and they're comparing those 2 treatments on the outcome measure is one of these CPTs, continuous computerized performance tests again. And you'll see that there are a number of lines, 4 lines on there, and each line corresponds to one of the facets or subtests, or excuse me, indices of this measure, if you will. So things like response time, variability, which is important because the greater the variability in reaction times on a computerized measure of attention, the more it kind of tells you that the person's attention is not consistent. There's times where they're spacing out, times when they're a little more on task. And then there are lines of omission and commission. Errors of omission refer to times when you were supposed to perhaps click on the mouse, but you didn't. And that would indicate that you weren't paying attention. Commission would be times when you clicked and you weren't supposed to, and so that might be evidence of impulse control issues. And so what they're showing here, for each line, take response time, for example. The first dot on the lower left of that response time line corresponds to the pretest, the baseline performance on this computerized measure. So the medication group scored about an 85. The neurofeedback group was a little closer to what, like 88. And then the second dot on that line is their post-test scores that corresponds to the post-test for each group. If a line is slanted a little more vertically, that would indicate preference toward the neurofeedback group, and if it were a little more horizontal, then it would show preference to the medication group. If it is parallel with that diagonal line centrally to the graph, that would indicate that there was no preference. One treatment group didn't beat out the other one. So you can see that in all cases, medication was slightly better, with the exception of variability was very parallel with that central line. And so this shows, again, that at least for this particular sample, neurofeedback was about as effective or maybe marginally better than medication. Here's another little study, the Thomas Fuchs-Tova data, the neurofeedback to Ritalin comparison, and essentially what you see is that neurofeedback really beat out Ritalin in a number of areas on these CPT measures, with the exception of reaction time, which is not surprising. If we're taking methylphenidate, we're likely to move a little faster, but according to this, not necessarily more carefully than if we were to do neurofeedback. ADHD is an extraordinarily heterogeneous disorder. Some believe that there are various endophenotypes. Others believe that really it's a catch-all category that we use when in fact we don't have a known etiological mechanism. And so a number of the people that we see who present with attention issues, once we really dig in, we actually find out they may have a history of head injuries, and so, or some people come to our clinic stating that they actually have, they've had some mild TBI, they've had some neurocognitive decline as a function of that. So we do end up seeing some folks who have mild or traumatic brain injuries, and there's some research out there, of course, that looks at that as well. And so, here's one study that shows that there's some significant improvement in sustained attention of individuals diagnosed with MTBI and comorbid ADHD after 20 treatment sessions. Here we've started to do some research on a very particular type of neurofeedback called infraslow fluctuation training. These infraslow oscillations, or ISOs, are oscillations that occur well below 1 hertz. They are empirically associated with a number of different things. These are non-rhythmic oscillations that are occurring. At 0.5 hertz, we know that there's that those oscillations tend to be a little more rhythmic, and they can be associated with things like hemodynamic activity of astrocytes. But the research actually indicates that probably what we're doing with this really slow training has less to do with any biological process that is occurring in the body, and probably more to do with time constants and basically cutoffs. Essentially what we're doing when we lower frequencies is we're creating really long epochs against which we can compare slight deviations from baseline within a particular frequency range. And what we're finding, the research that's coming out now is really exciting about it. It's ISOs are associated with important things with neuroplastic dependent processes, overall cortical excitability. There's a number of really interesting studies coming out about this. So anyway, we started looking at this here, and we're starting to do some research where we have folks coming in and the college-age population identifying with attention concerns. Our dependent variables, we do a QEEG, which we'll talk about in a moment, a CPT, that computerized measure of attention, and measures of executive functioning. And we just wanted to see some pre-post comparisons after 10 sessions of ISF neurofeedback. The idea was to do a comparison of the no contact group. And I say that in past tense because we're actually going to switch gears. This year we are starting to develop a new intervention that utilizes ISF, but it combines it with cognitive training, and so far we're really liking the effects of that, so we're interested in doing some of the research, and I think it's best if we're not conducting that research, so we have to talk with some other folks to see if they're interested in looking at what we're doing. But let me give you an example of someone we saw and conducted ISF training with. This is pretty interesting. So we had a young man who came in, 19-year-old Caucasian male, long-standing diagnosis of ADHD. When I meet him, he says he's been treated with stimulants for a number of years. I get to the clinical interview and ask about head injuries. He goes, yeah, I think I did have a head injury. And I said, really, what do you recall about that? And he recalls that he was told that he was dropped when he was very young. And I said, do you know if you were taken to the hospital? Did they do any imaging? And they said, I think my mom has something. And this is what he brought back, which is pretty amazing. So you can see pretty clearly these 2 and 4 millimeter frontal lesions. So we're not necessarily looking at ADHD here. This may actually be, the attentional symptomatology may just be part of a larger issue. We go ahead and we do something called a QEEG. It's a quantitative EEG, and basically what we do is we're putting a 19-channel cap over someone's head, and we're recording the electrical values over a period of time, and then we take those aggregates and we compare them against a normative database, a couple thousand people who've been really thoroughly tested, and they have no history of neurological, psychological, psychiatric issues. And then we ask, okay, are there electrical deviations that are really significant from this normative database? And that's what you're seeing here. This is kind of a map we sometimes affectionately refer to as a brain map. And you can see along the top row, that's the absolute power metric, and it shows absolute power relative to the normative database in each of these 5 EEG components: delta, theta, alpha, beta, high beta. And for this young man, you can see excessive delta and theta. Those are 2 to 3 standard deviations. Excessive activity, delta and theta, left prefrontally, and also P4, right parietal. And so that would correspond with some of the symptomatology he was reporting. We went ahead and did a CPT, a computerized measure of attention and impulse control. And the mean of this test is 100 with standard deviations of 15. So you can see that there's some real significant impairment both in his attention quotient as well as his response control or impulse control quotient, if you will. And so we only got to see him for 8 sessions. He had to return home over the summer for internship activities. So, 8 sessions is not even half of the amount of time you would normally see someone. So we didn't expect much of a change. And yet for this young man, there was quite a change. His response control quotient normalizes to the average range, almost high average range. And his attention quotient falls 3 points shy of entering the average range being 90 to 109. This met his day-to-day experience. He reported a number of improvements, most notably with regard to attention and working memory. That left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, of course, is important in lots of different things. And so here's his brain map after training. And as you can see, those frontal slow wave components are no longer deviant. Delta and theta look pretty good there. Again, there's still a little bit of work to be done, particularly in that one connectivity metric called amplitude, symmetry, and coherence. But for 8 sessions, I'm pretty happy with that. So that's neurofeedback in a nutshell. The other thing we do at our clinic is we do something called cognitive training. And we have our own approach to cognitive training we've been doing for about 8 years, I think. We developed it. I went and did some training with someone who developed a cognitive training method, and he said, you have to do coaching with your people. And I went, what does that mean? I wasn't exactly sure, so I did what I thought was coaching, and I have a pretty deep background in cognitive psychology, so I was using principles from cognitive psychology to try to help coach students through some of these cognitive tasks. And as it turns out, our approach is really unique. There aren't many people who do things quite like our approach to cognitive training, which is kind of interesting, because once you hear a little bit about it, you'd expect everybody would be doing it that way. So what is cognitive training? It's essentially an approach in which cognitive tasks are used to enhance cognitive performance. They're often presented in game-like format, but that's not necessary. They're often computerized, but that's for the sake of convenience. We are not a computer-only model. We sometimes use cognitive training in tandem with neurofeedback. Sometimes we use neurofeedback to ready the brain. There's a cool study out of 2013 where they compare neurofeedback to a sham condition, and they actually find some pretty significant gray and white matter volume changes in a very short period of time. And so it's kind of neat to be thinking about some of the preparation we might be doing with neurofeedback, and then once we lay the groundwork, we harness that state of readiness and kind of guide the brain with cognitive training. Oftentimes when we hit a plateau with cognitive training, then we may even switch back to neurofeedback and vice versa. So usually when people hear cognitive training, if they know anything about it at all, immediately they tend to be somewhat dismissive. The first thing people often think of when they hear cognitive training are commercial brain games like Lumosity. The only similarity of what we're doing with things like Lumosity is that both are purported to improve cognitive functioning through cognitive tasks or cognitive training. There are, however, a number of really big differences, and we can talk about that a little bit here. Other approaches, first of all, they tend to be what we call computer-only models. You sit down, you click start on the app, or someone clicks go, and away to the races, right? So the problem with that is that a lot of times people will then hit a plateau, even if the games selected somehow were pertinent to the individual. Once they hit a plateau, that's pretty much it. They get demoralized, frustrated, and they close the app, and that's the end of it. Our approach is client-centered and clinician-driven. So the clinician is trained in basically how to watch a person perform cognitive tasks and how to assess and identify where the weak links are in the cognitive chain, and then how to intervene, how to accommodate the task or scaffold the task in a way that can begin to strengthen up that weak link in the cognitive chain. So what about cognitive training? Is it effective? Does it work? Very mixed results overall, and I'd like to talk a little bit about why that is. But here's one study. Here's a generated total of 4,931 publications in a meta-analysis, and really what they're finding is that only 28 were included in the review, which already tells you that the research on cognitive training is quite poor. And then what they found, of course, in those 23 that met the inclusionary criteria is that there were significant improvements in attention and executive functioning. But again, the empirical efficacy is often mixed, and there's a number of reasons, I think, why that is. I think we're just not doing a good job of studying cognitive training or even defining it, and that's the first issue. Cognitive training is poorly defined and operationalized in the research. Sometimes they'll define cognitive training, or they will use poor content validity, and they'll say, okay, we're going to study cognitive training, we're going to select this one task. We have no idea if this task is pertinent to the particular sample that we're training, but we're going to select that, and then we're going to say that's the representative of all that is cognitive training. That's an error. The other issue is things like this. Here's a great example. Some of the studies in cognitive training look at things like end-back tasks. And if you don't know much about an end-back task, I'll show you an example of that in a moment. And what we find is that end-back tasks are face valid as a working memory task, but they actually don't demonstrate any convergent validity with at least one psychometrically based measure of working memory. So that's a problem, yet researchers who are conducting research on this kind of thing are unfortunately thinking that an end-back task is representative of cognitive training. And again, if you don't know what an end-back task is, here it is. Essentially, N in end-back refers to a variable load which can be modulated or changed in order to increase the difficulty and the load on working memory. So you'll notice that there's two examples actually in this picture. The individual sees each one of these frames systematically, one after the other, and the job, the instruction is you are to click. Since this is going to be a two-back task, in the verbal example, you are to click anytime you see a letter that occurred 2 frames ago. So in the first frame, you see a V, second frame, you see a V, third, a Q, fourth, an R, fifth, a Q. So on that 5th frame, you're supposed to click because the Q corresponds to the letter Q that occurred 2 frames ago. You could also do this spatially as well. So the bottom of this little figure shows a spatial example. You'd be pressing on the 3rd slide the first time the Q appears because its spatial location is at the same location of the V in the first frame. So this is often employed as a cognitive training task. It would be considered one type of working memory called updating models of working memory, but it's still a very controversial thing to even look at. Some other problems with the research in cognitive training, they often use one-size-fits-all approaches. That's really an issue. Like I use this image because I thought it was pretty funny. It'd be like if we were trying to determine visual acuity by showing this massive letter E and saying, can you see this? Well, if you can see it, then your eyesight's fine. That's a problem, of course, because the only thing that this giant E is going to help differentiate is whether someone can see or not. It's not going to help tell us what the granular level of acuity that we would often get in these kinds of tests. So that's a problem. Another issue is that attention, working memory, and other systems of cognition are not unitary. By the way, someone has their microphone on, I think. So attention and working memory, we often talk about them like, oh yeah, that's that one thing that occurs in the brain. But really, that's not how these things work from a cognitive standpoint, certainly from a cognitive neuroscience standpoint. Someone says, I have poor memory. Well, here's human memory. Which part of memory? Let's suppose that someone says, well, it's my short-term. We don't really call it short-term anymore. There's short-term storage, but it's usually a part of a working memory system. But they say, well, my short-term memory is not so good. Well, even then, what part of working memory is problematic? And this is only, by the way, what you're looking at. Badley's model of working memory is only one of 3 or 4 different empirically researched models of working memory. Or my other favorite one is students come in and they say, my attention's poor. Well, I don't know what they mean by that. I often am left kind of doing formulas in my head trying to understand what they mean when they say I have bad attention. If you pick up any classic textbook, cognitive psychology textbook in the 90s, you see that there are oftentimes four major types of attention discussed. There's signal detection, selective, alternating, and divided. Then a little more recently, you have Michael Posner, who wants to tie cognition to a little bit more empirical neuroscience. And he starts to look at alerting, orienting, and executive types of attention. And then even more modern, and this is not an exhaustive list, we have large-scale brain networks, default mode network, dorsal attention, ventral attention, frontal parietal. There's even the cingulatopercular and others. When someone comes into us and they say that they have poor attention, we want to try to understand in a very granular way what's going on. And we think a lot about, and kind of nerd out about how all of these concepts are linked. So we're looking at QEEG data, we're looking at clinical interview, we're looking at our cognitive testing, and then coming up with a treatment plan to try to help them with whatever attention means. And by the way, attention could mean that they have chronic sleep deprivation, poor nutritional, lots of substance use, many, many more fundamental issues that could account for their attentional problems other than purely cognitive one. Other reasons why cognitive training research is usually bad. Well, if these things are not unitary, things like attention and working memory, that means that we would need to be doing studies on all the lower order components of these systems. So, in the working memory model, Badley's working memory model, there are individual slave systems, ways in which those slave systems interact with the central executive, et cetera. To really do cognitive training research, I think would mean you'd have to do research on those lower order component skills, as well as how they are orchestrated at a more executive or higher order level. And then, as we discussed before, the computer-only model fails. So a lot of these studies, they put people in front of a computer, and the computer is dumb. It runs on kind of crude algorithms and schemas that really can't help to continue to train the person once they hit plateaus. And finally, maybe one of the last issues is that there's usually a mismatch between the scope of the cognitive task and the dependent variable being measured. So you see a lot of this kind of thing occur in the literature. We're going to improve some facet of working memory, and then we're going to test someone's IQ. And then when they don't find a huge difference in IQ, which is a huge multifaceted construct, they conclude that cognitive training is not effective. Well, that would be very much like training someone's biceps and then expecting their squat numbers to go up. We shouldn't expect one to necessarily create huge changes in the other. Our approach, as I said, is much different. Cognitive functions like muscles of the body can be cultivated and strengthened. We understand and identify problems via cognitive component analysis. So we watch how a person is going through a task, and then we deconstruct it, and we try to identify where in the cognitive system things have gone awry, and then we scaffold the task to help address those particular issues. For us, therapeutic relationships are really critical to the success of the training. I'm asking people to do things which are demoralizing and which reveal long-standing cognitive issues, and that can be embarrassing and shameful. And so, at the very least, to have the therapeutic relationship to sort of hold and help clients get through those things can be quite useful. Cognitive training for us does not rely on computer software. For us, it's about the clinician. If our computers go down, we need to be creative enough and flexible enough to draw upon the broad principles of our interventions to help improve someone's work. I usually say I can watch someone at work, and if they tell me what it is they want to improve, I might be able to offer them tips. It doesn't require a computer to do that. We just use it because it's usually much more convenient to do so. There's no one path to improve. I am often asked by interns, well, can you make a flow chart for how we're supposed to do cognitive training and neurofeedback? And it's sort of hard to do that. We really arm ourselves with these broad intervention principles. We flexibly draw from them as needed. So why does our approach work? We're not entirely sure. We know that we're seeing some big changes, which I'm going to talk about here in a moment. But I cannot tell you why just yet. We don't have the research to tell you why. We would love to think that what we're doing is we're directly improving facets of a person's cognitive system, but there could also be some other mediating variables that are helping them to get better, everything from determination to instilling growth mindset. Maybe just having a person sitting in a room a couple of hours a week concentrating really hard is sufficient, or maybe just improving their internal sense of agency is really big. But for whatever reason, we are seeing effects. So we did we're going to publish this year. We have a cohort of about 3 years of students who only received cognitive training, which was actually quite a small number because most of them are getting neurofeedback and cognitive training. So we only looked at those who received cognitive training. About 40 college students in this. And what we're finding is that after about 10 weeks of training, we train twice a week, so that's about 20 sessions. There was about a 2 standard deviation increase in attention scores, and about 70% of the sample no longer exhibits quantitative impairments in attention, CPT. Now we're going to start collecting new data that includes much more than just CPT data. We have to get to executive functioning. So what we want to do is demonstrate something called FAR transfer, which is that big issue that often comes up. It makes cognitive training quite controversial. The idea of does training in a particular task make you just better at the task, or does that confer benefits to your everyday functioning, your everyday cognitive functioning? Excuse me. Here's someone we saw who only did cognitive training, another 19-year-old, previously treated with stimulants. And here what you can see is that their attention quotient looks quite good at a 117, but their response control looks quite poor. Really what's going on there is they're just clicking all the time. And so it artificially inflates the attention quotient and shows that they're clicking when they're not supposed to. Their attention after, just look at the full scale numbers here, after cognitive training doesn't really change because of course they're already kind of at the ceiling, but their response control goes up massively, so 78 points, which is actually over a few standard deviations there for this person. And their brain map, which went from kind of problematic, really improves pretty markedly. And again, this is only in 10 weeks. This is only cognitive training. This is no neurofeedback. So I see that we're almost out of time. I don't know if we have time to give any kind of demonstration of cognitive training at this point. Do we need a couple of minutes for questions or anything of that nature?
I do. Can you hear me?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I think that it would be definitely good to leave some time. I don't know, How long does the demonstration take?
Yeah, probably more than what we have.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So we can bring it back another time for that then.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good.
That'll be great. So with that, thank you for that overview. I think those who are on the call, if you don't care to unmute your lines if you have a question, or use the chat function.
or bring the chat thing up. I may not see it.
I guess if I could, I'll start with a question to you. Knowing that many people on here, I think your traumatic brain injury program is represented, assistive technology, our WVATS program, our PBS, positive behavior, many of these teams interact with individuals who may benefit from this. What is a good way when you're serving someone with a particular focus? What's a good way for us to identify someone who might be eligible for what you do? And then what would that process look like? What are the opportunities for bringing this research to practice in our area?
No, that's a great question. Currently, we're only seeing WVU students, though there's been some discussion and interest in creating an external-facing clinic. I would love to see that happen in the coming years. But if you have students that you think would really benefit from our services, you can simply send them along for what we call a MindFit consult, and I'll be happy to meet with them for half an hour to an hour just to kind of assess their readiness and their interest in the program, their motivation. The big things that I'm usually looking for as exclusionary criteria, and so I'll share this with you for your consideration. I'm definitely wanting to know a bit about lifestyle issues. What's their sleep like? Substance concerns. They have mental health concerns. Of course, if there's anxiety and depression that I believe could be treated or ameliorated through some therapy, I might try to help them get connected with a therapist first. If arousal and composure issues, which are much more fundamental, and when I say arousal and composure, I mean, sleep deprivation could be chronic hypoarousal, PTSD could be chronic hyperarousal. We want to try to help, palliate some of those things before we can really make a big effect with cognitive training and neurofeedback. That said, I wouldn't necessarily rule it out either. So, if you have someone you think would benefit from it, we'd be happy to meet with them, and we could try along with the client to figure out whether our services will be best for them.
Okay, great. Any other questions?
I guess the only question I would have, I know with your study that you're just doing WVU students, but has any study similar to this been done with younger students?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's actually a lot of research out there. So you're right. I'm only talking about the folks that we serve. But for instance, neurofeedback is beginning to be regarded as potentially a first-line treatment for. I want to be careful about what I say here, but I would encourage you to go look at the literature. And I think what we're finding is that it's really being regarded as a very viable approach to the treatment of attentional concerns. And there's also some data out there that supports it could be helpful for TBI as well. Some of the cognitive training tasks, by the way, are built and really geared toward children. Sometimes I have to preface working with a 18 or 19-year-old young man or woman, and I have to let them know that some of the games they're going to see may seem childlike. It's because the software is really oriented toward children. So there's a lot of work that happens with that age range.
Okay.
Yeah. My goal too, and this is something that I've shared with Leslie once before. Really, my goal is, I want to be effective with our interventions. I want to help people in a very real way. And then what I'd like to do is I want to start disseminating this. I want to get more folks who work with individuals who are experiencing attention, cognitive issues. I'd like to put this in their hands so that they can begin to offer this as an intervention themselves. Having something here at WVU Clinic does not help the entire state. We're a land grant institution, and part of our 2020 plan, of course, is to find ways really to be meaningfully engaging the rest of the state. And so my greatest hope is that we'll start offering trainings, in time to come, so that we can get more practitioners out there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So in the meantime, would you have any materials that you would advise people? I know you're pointing us to research, which is making sure we use evidence-based materials. Great. Do you have some that you would recommend for, again, people that we serve that we can give to them in any way?
I'd have to think about that. You're talking to giving it to the clients that you serve?
Right. If there are certain, I don't know if the research is to the point where if there are certain activities they can do in their recliner or in their own house just to start with the focus, the frontal lobe activities, or anything about cognitive therapies.
Right. I could certainly get you something that gives some description and overview of those interventions. I would have to do some research. I know what you're asking for, which is, are there good things that you can do for your brain that don't require a clinician? And I think the answer is yes to that. I don't spend a lot, of course, because I am a clinician, that's usually my role in a person's life. And so some of the recommendations I'll give them from day to day might seem a little lame to put out there broadly, but I'm sure that there are some really good resources that would offer those kinds of activity lists for people to do. I mean, the brain benefits from just about anything you can do to challenge it. We know even just reversing the order in which you brush your teeth is kind of a helpful thing. Right now, one thing I'm doing is teaching myself to learn how to write with my right hand. I'm left-handed. So there's some neuroprotective things that a person can do that might be helpful. But usually my lens is just on the kind of more the clinical intervention stuff that we do here in MindFit.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, we're at 3 o'clock. We're past 3 o'clock, and we really appreciate your time, Dr. Long, and hope that this goes into something greater in terms of collaborations with the center. But really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much. And if you have any further questions, please reach out. I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay.
Thank you.
So thank you. Everyone have a nice Thanksgiving, and we'll be sending a follow-up evaluation for this presentation here shortly. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.